Okay, so lesson 3.7 is congruent triangle proofs, or proofs of congruent triangles, whichever way you would like to write it.
Where does that go in the topic?
Yes, in the topic.
Triangle truth, you said?
Can you go with me, please, to page 32?
Truth?
Proofs.
Proofs.
Proofs. So in this lesson today, we are proving that two triangles are congruent. Does anybody remember from Thursday the ways that we prove triangles to be congruent? There's a couple different ways. Side, side, side is one of them. Okay, so Charmony is reminding us of side, side, side. So we'll put that here in number 1. SSS for side, side, side. That means that all three pairs of sides match up. What's another one? Angle, side, angle. What do we have to remember about angle, side, angle, Brian?
It can also be HL.
No. What do we have to remember about the side in particular? It has to be in between the two angles, right? It has to be the included side. Okay, what's another way that we know that two triangles are congruent? Julia?
Side, angle, side.
Side, angle, side. And Julia, what do we have to remember about the angle there inside angle, side? The angle is in between the two sides. Good. What's another way that we can remember that two triangles are congruent, or prove that two triangles are congruent? Y'all have notes you can look back on, FYI. Natasha? HL. I'm going to make HL number 5. Okay, and then the fourth one that we were missing was angle, angle, side. Okay, the thing about HL is that we're not going to see it very often. Remember, HL is ASS, but we don't write ASS in school. Remember we talked about that? So we actually write it as HL, which is hypotenuse leg. What do we have to know about hypotenuse leg? We can only use it if it's what? If there's a right angle, right? So we can only use it if there is the right angle.
And congruent was equal, right?
Yes, congruent means equal. Okay, so if you look at this paper here, this looks a little bit different than maybe something you've ever seen. Okay, these are what are called two-column proofs, which just means we're going to try to prove, we're going to get some information, and based on this information, we're going to try to prove that the two triangles in our diagram are congruent. And the way we're going to do that is to use some of the rules that we actually already know. And if you look in your papers, guys, if you look at the page right before, page 30, if you flip this up and you look at page 30, this right here, where it says reasons why sides are congruent and reasons why angles are congruent, these definitions and rules right here are what we're going to focus on a lot. Right? These things right here are going to help us when we're writing our proof. So it's convenient that it's right there as I can lift up. One thing we're going to add to the reasons that sides are congruent. Okay, so on this paper, one thing we're going to add to the reasons that sides are congruent is definition of segment bisector. This is page 30. Definition of segment bisector. That's not listed here, and that's going to be one of the reasons that we need to use. Remember, we talked about reflexive property means that it's congruent to itself. We have vertical angles down there to talk about why angles are congruent. So we're going to use this to help. Okay? All right, so let's look back at page 32. Has anyone ever seen a two-column proof before? My girls from geometry. Their favorite thing ever. All right, so we're going to learn this together. We're going to learn about what this is supposed to look like. In my computer. Just crazy. Okay, so you notice that I have two columns, right? I have the left column, which is statements, and I have the right column, which is reasons. And then I have some given information. And I have a diagram. We will always mark the diagram with what's been given to us. Not what we're being asked to prove, but what's been given to us. Okay? So the very, very, very first thing to do is always write down statement number 1. And statement number 1 will always be whatever is written up here in the given. That's going to go down and be statement number 1. So I've been given that AE bisects BD. That was given to me. And they also told me in the given that angle B is congruent to angle D. So the first step in setting up the proof is just to write down what you have been given. And then my reasons category is, why do you know what you just wrote? Okay, why did you just write that? Well, we just wrote that for number 1 because it was given to us. So we just write given. I don't have to explain to you why I know that. They just told me it was true. So I'm going to write given. Reason number 1 is always given. Okay? Statement number 1 always comes from whatever's up here. Questions about step number 1? You can always get it started. Even if you have no idea how to do proof, you can always get it started. Okay, so let's go ahead and mark in our diagram what we've been given. AE bisects BD. What does bisect mean? Cut it in half. Okay, so this segment here, AE, cut this one in half. Okay, so if it's going to cut that one in half, that means that BC is congruent to CD. Would you guys agree with that? Okay. That's what it means to cut in half, right? And then it tells me that angle B is congruent to angle D. So let's mark that. Angle B is congruent to angle D. And we draw these arc marks to represent that angles are congruent. Okay, so now here's the rule. Here's how we keep going through the proof. If I mark it in the diagram, I have to write it in the proof. So I have marked that BC is congruent to CD, right? We marked that BC is congruent to CD. But do I have that specifically in my proof anywhere? BC congruent to CD. Is that written anywhere in our proof? No. So I'm going to write number 2. BC is congruent to CD. Because even though it says that it bisects, if I'm an idiot and don't know what bisect means, okay, then you're going to be even more specific and tell me, okay, well, bisect means that these two pieces are congruent to each other. So then reason number 2, we have to think about, why did we know that those two segments were congruent to each other? Because it was bisected, right? It told me it was bisected. So this is where we look back at page 30. Reasons that sides are congruent. We just wrote down definition of segment bisector, right? And so we see the word bisect in our proof. So that means that I need bisect in my reason. Definition, we can abbreviate definition of segment bisector. Okay, so I am still trying to use one of that side angle, side angle, side angle to prove that these two triangles in my diagram are congruent to each other. Is there anything else that I have not marked that maybe we are allowed to mark in our diagram? What are vertical? We have vertical angles. Do you guys see that in the middle? We have vertical angles that make the X, right? These two angles together make that X shape. Okay, so let's go ahead and mark those two angles congruent. We're going to use a double hash mark because we've already used, or a double arc because we've already used one arc. Excuse me. But what's the rule? If I mark it, I have to write it. Did we mark anywhere that those two angles are congruent to each other? We didn't. Now, I can't just say angle C, because if you say angle C, are you talking about this angle? Are you talking about this angle? Are you talking about this one? Which one are you talking about? So instead of that, to make life a little bit easier, what we're allowed to do is just say, this is angle 1, and this is angle 2. Okay, so we're allowed to just make it angle 1 and angle 2, as long as you've written it in your diagram. So step number 3 is going to say, okay, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And why did we know those two angles were congruent? Because they're vertical angles. And let's look back on page 30. Do you see where it says reasons angles are congruent? Look back on page 30 with me. Where it says reasons that angles are congruent, number 2 says vertical angles. You guys see that? Okay. So we're just going to use that as reason number 3. Number 3. Vertical angles are congruent. So I just abbreviated angles with, and I used the angle symbol with an S. So let's look at our diagram. Do I have enough in my diagram to say that these two triangles are congruent to each other? What do you guys think? Do you have two sides that are congruent, Julia?
We have two angles that are congruent.
Okay, so it wouldn't be side, angle, side.
Angle side.
Angle, then a side, then an angle. Do you guys see that? We have angle, side, angle, right? Now look at what our proof statement says over here. Our proof statement says, hey, prove that those two triangles are congruent to each other. Did we prove that those two triangles are congruent to each other? We did, right? We found angle, side, angle. And angle, side, angle is enough to say that the two triangles are congruent. So now that I have enough proof, see what I did there? Number 4 is going to just be whatever the proof statement is. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DBC. So I'm just rewriting down the proof statement. Should that be what? Oh, DEC instead? ABC. It should be EDC, shouldn't it? Is that what you said? Mm-hmm. EDC, that's a... I need to fix that in my paper, huh? This should be EDC. Good catch, Germany. And you said you didn't like these. Okay, so we said that these two triangles are congruent. We can use one of those 4 rules up above by angle, side angle, congruency. So you're just going to put angle, side angle, congruency. And we're finished. And you just did your first geometry proof. Woo! Woo! What'd you say? Not with us, they don't. Okay, before we move on, does anyone have any initial questions on this first one? It should be brand new to you, kind of what are we doing, but as we go through, I think you're going to pick it up. Elvis?
Are we still, sorry, on 4?
Yes.
Does it matter what order we put it in?
So on number 4, I would just write down whatever the proof is. Just don't even try to guess it from the diagram. Just write down exactly what the proof is. And our proof was wrong, as Sharmini reminded us. So, yes, just write it down as it is, okay? All right, let's do another one. Because you're so excited about these, I can tell. Okay, this is proof number 2. Okay, proof number 2. How do we get started? How do we get started? Write down the given. Excellent. All right, so the first thing I see you guys doing is writing down whatever was given to you. So PQ congruent to RS, and angle PQS is congruent to angle RSQ. What's always reason number 1? Given. Okay. Okay, now I don't know what the steps are in between. I don't know how many there are. But I do know that my last statement of my proof is always going to be the proof statement, right? No matter how long it takes me to get there, no matter how many steps, I always know that this proof statement is going to be the very end. Okay, so what I can do now is I can go ahead and leave some space and write triangle PQS is congruent to triangle RSQ. I'm going to get some points on my test for even writing the closing statement. Even though I don't know what the reason is, even though I don't know how many steps down it is, I know it goes at the very bottom. Okay? So we can go ahead and write that, and then we can fill in the numbers as we go on. All right, so we've written our given statement. What's our next step after we've written our given statement and our proof statement? Ashley, what are you doing right there? What are you doing on your paper right now?
I'm writing down what they gave me.
She's marking her diagram with what's been given. Okay, so that is our next step. So PQ is congruent to RS. Did they write that specifically in our proof? PQ congruent to RS. Do you guys see that specifically? It is in our given. Okay, so we don't have to write that again. And then angle PQS. So make sure you follow correctly. P to Q to S is that top one. And then R to S to Q is that bottom one there. Mark that angle congruent. Okay, we already have a side and we already have an angle. Any ideas what else I can write about? Ashley? What is that?
I can't remember.
Look back at your thing and see if you can remember what it's called. It's a shared side. Reflexive. Do you guys remember that? That QS? Reflexive. That QS is reflexive to itself. Do you guys remember that? So reflexive, which is right here. It means it's congruent to itself. Do you see how that's a shared side? That QS is shared. They share that side. So we can mark it congruent. But if we mark it congruent, what do we have to do, Donald? If we mark it in a diagram, what do we have to do? Put it in our statements. That's exactly right. Put it in our statements. So we've already marked that QS is congruent to each other. So, excuse me. Statement number 2 is going to say QS is congruent to QS.
Okay.
And why do we know that's true?
Reflexive.
Reflexive property. And if you look back at your paper on page 30, it says reflexive property. We're going to use that one a lot, the reflexive property. So I'm putting reflexive property, and I'm just going to put my congruency symbol right after that. Again, our goal is to get our triangles to be congruent using side, 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 angle, angle, side, whatever it is. Do we have enough information in our diagram to say that my two triangles are congruent? Yes. Sharmini, how are we going to say that they're congruent? Which one are we going to use? Side, angle, side. Does anyone agree with Sharmini? That it's side, angle, side? Right, because I have a side here. The angle is in the middle between the two sides, right? So now we actually are already at the end.
Side, side.
Not side, side, angle. That doesn't work unless you have a right or a right angle.
I was just saying.
So now we actually are finished. So the proof statement, we're done. So this now becomes number 3, even though we left some space. And the reason we know that these triangles are congruent was because of side, angle, side congruency. Side, angle, side congruency. Any questions about that? We kind of getting the hang of it a little bit better? The way you keep moving through your proof is to use your diagram. Okay? Why don't you go ahead and start, although you can't set up number 3 because the picture is missing. So let me help you set up number 3. Is your number 3 picture missing?
Yes.
Okay. This is what it looks like. So go ahead and draw that. Okay, let me show you how to draw it, folks. It's not that hard. Draw an X. Then connect. That was rough. Draw your X, then connect.
Yours was different.
We're on this one up here. That's fine. That's fine.
It's not mine.
No, it's fine. Just put your letters in now.
Look at that.
Put your letters in. Go ahead and set up statement and reason number 1 and start marking your diagram.
You want us to mark the angles or?
Yeah, go ahead and mark A and E. They marked them for you, right? Because it's in the given, so make sure you mark them.
That's not coming out.
Brian, draw an X.
I drew an X. I'm not connected.
No, that's not.
That
Erase
was an
this.
X. I know how to make an X.
Look what I did right there. This one's slanted. Then this one. Okay, so you're going to do your own way. So set up your number 1. And remember, you can also put the last statement on there somewhere at the bottom, even though we don't know how much it's going to be. Okay, so I think we've all gotten step number 1 done, and then I see a lot of you putting that prove down there, right? We don't know how long this is going to take to get us down here, but we do know that triangle ABC congruent to triangle EDC does go at the bottom. All right, anything that we can mark that's not been marked that was given to us? Elvis? Go again. You're all right. You're too deep in now. Look, AE bisects BD. So what does bisect mean?
Cuts it in half.
Cuts it in half, right? So what has been cut in half? Has BD been cut in half, or did AE get cut in half?
Are we putting this for number 2?
We're just talking about the diagram first.
D, DC, and CB.
Perfect.
That's what I
DC and CB should be marked congruent to each other, because it says that AE cuts this one in half. Okay, so you got to be careful that you read it. Okay, now we marked it in our diagram, but is it written in our statement that specifically BC is congruent to CD? Do we have that yet? No, so we specifically have to write that. So that's going to give us our step number 2. That BC is congruent to CD. Katie, why do we know that those two are congruent? What's your reason there? Katie has written definition of segment bisector. She has a bit of a cold, so I'll say it for her. But on her paper, she wrote definition of segment bisector. So we'll go ahead and write definition of segment bisector. Yeah, Natasha? You want to go to the next one? Is that what you want to do?
No, I just want to show you this. Can I do it like that? It doesn't have to be like straight across.
What do you mean?
Like, can I do side angle?
Yes, but it turns into something. Oh, I see what you did. Yes, and then you went and did this first. That's fine. Yep. Okay, what else in our diagram that is not marked that should be marked, Kara? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Vertical angles, right? But instead of naming those angles, we can put what in there that's going to make life easier? A 1 and a 2. Okay? So then we can say angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. So we'll go ahead and mark that number 3. Remember, if you're going to put angle 1 and angle 2, you have to mark angle 1 and angle 2 in your diagram, which one is 1 and which one is 2. Why do we know that? What's our reason going to be here? Hortensia, what's going to be our reason here? Because they're vertical angles. Good. So we're just going to write vertical angles. And you can put vertical angles are congruent if you want to. Okay, now do we have enough information, or do we need to keep going to figure out if these two triangles are congruent?
Side equals side.
We have enough. What do we have here?
Side equals side.
Side, angle, angle, right? Do you guys see that? Side, angle, angle. Look, in one triangle, you only have one side that's been marked. But side, angle, angle isn't, I mean, it's the same as one other one, but how do we really say it? Angle, angle, side. Okay? So now we're ready for step number 4. Step number 4 is angle, angle, side.
Did you put a, sorry, I can't really see the diagram. Did you put an angle on E?
Yes, because that was in our given, right? In our given statement, that was given to us right here. So it was actually already marked, which is why I didn't mark it. But yes, it should be marked. Yeah. Okay, now I want to explain something to you before we go on to the next one. Natasha on her paper has number 2 and 3 steps flipped. Okay? It's totally okay that they're flipped. We just got to get them into the proof. All right? And so as you're working these proofs, if you see vertical angles first, you can mark vertical angles and talk about that first, but you have to make sure you come back and get all the other valuable information. All right, I'm going to give you a few minutes to start and do as much as you can on proof number 4. Do as much as you can on proof number 4. Try things, use page 30 to help you. So if you're watching the video, you can pause and do as much as you can on number 4. All right, let's do a little check. So number 1, you guys have MA congruent to TA. And I saw everybody marking that. MA and TA. And then it says A is the midpoint of SR. Number 1 reason is always given, right? So you guys have that. If A is the midpoint of SR, Tylea, what do I know? If A is the midpoint of SR, what do you know? Tylea. Okay, if A is in the middle here, what do we know about this segment and this segment? They're congruent, right? Okay, so if something's in the middle, then I know that this segment is congruent to this segment. Now I marked it. Is it specifically written in my proof already that SA and AR are congruent to each other? Is this specifically already written? Do you see that anywhere? No. Okay, so that's going to be, it can be step number 2 or 3. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to say SA is congruent to AR. But why do I know this is true? Did anybody look back on page 30? Carla? Definition of midpoint. Good. Definition of midpoint. Okay, and then I saw on most of your papers, I think everybody had the next step. What's the next thing you're looking for, Monique? Which angles? Are they the middle ones? Okay, so Monique is saying angle 1 and angle 2. I'm assuming you mean the vertical angles, right, Monique? Okay, so we know that we have vertical angles to be congruent. So angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. So if we mark it, we can write it. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And what's the reason for that, guys? Vertical angles.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Okay, so you said I was missing something?
I'm getting there.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll call on you.
Okay.
Okay, so this is what I have in my diagram so far. If you marked anything else, you are incorrect. Nothing else in this diagram can be marked. So if you have other markings in your diagram than these 3 things, you need to use your eraser. Okay, nothing else, we don't know anything else is congruent. But we are trying to get the outside edges to be congruent. And if I want these two to be congruent to each other, the only way I can do that is to first say, what, Elvis?
That's not where I was going.
Okay, Sharmini, what do we have to say first? That this triangle first is congruent to this triangle. Do you guys remember that CPCTC thing? Okay, let me explain that to you. It says if you can say that these two triangles are congruent, then everything else has to match up. Then my MS and RT can be congruent to each other. Do I have enough information right now to say that these two triangles are congruent to each other? Do we have angle, angle, side, or angle, side, angle? We do, right? We have actually side, angle, side. Okay, so step number 4, and this should be everyone's number 4. Step number 4 should be if I say triangle MAS, I want you to match that. If I say triangle MAS, what triangle are you going to say? Write it down on your paper. If I say MAS, what are you going to write? Write it down on your paper, please. Who wants to give it a go? Elvis, what'd you say?
Triangle MAS is congruent to triangle TAR.
Okay, does anybody agree with TAR? Did anyone see RAT? Okay, let's talk about this. From M, look at your diagram. From M to A, you go past how many hash marks? 1, right? That means that when you talk about the other triangle, which one is the first hash mark? T to A, right? So you have to say triangle TAR. If you say RAT, it's not the same thing. Remember we talked about on Thursday making sure that things match up? Look, MA are the first two and TA are the first two. That means they match up. We talked about that. So the reason for number 4 is side angle side. And now that my triangles are congruent, I know that everything else has to match up. So because I've said that my triangles are congruent, number 5 can be MS congruent to TR. The reason for that is CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles is congruent. It's not going to be rough. You're going to be fine. Here's the hint, guys. Let me tell you this. This is going to be a helpful hint. If you look up in your proof, this was the only proof of the 4 that we've done that didn't end in triangles. Right? The first 3 were saying the triangles are congruent and that's where you stopped. Okay? And most of the ones in your homework are the triangles congruent and that's where you stop. If it's one where it's pieces of the triangle, you know that first you need to say triangles are congruent and then you can just say CPCTC. All right, so look at what you're trying to prove. If it's just triangles, then you can just end on a side angle side or angle side angle, whatever. If it's got segments or pieces of a triangle, then that means you're going to end on CPCTC. Okay, you have examples to help you. So we're going to go ahead and start homework number, what is this one? 16. Okay, your 2 columns are not drawn for you, so you can draw your 2 columns. Go ahead and do that. Draw your 2 columns, your statements, your reasons. And you have 4 proofs to do.